this research that I've been doing around sexual violence and the Black freedom movement. So, time-wise, I'm locating this in the 1960s. This story begins in 1962. It's January 21st. We're in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Two white police officers arrest an African-American teenager. Her name is Betsy Turner. They arrest her at her home on the charge of stealing money from a local government employee who she works with. Turner, who denies the theft, by the way, is taken to county jail for interrogation. Once detained, her questioning quickly turns sadistic and violent. The teenager is made to lay face down on the concrete floor of the interrogation room and ordered to pull her dress down and panties up. She is then repeatedly whipped with belts of the arresting officers on her back and buttocks. Turn over and open up your legs and let me see how you look down there, demands one of the police officers. He then proceeds to lash Turner between her legs on her genitals. Amidst threats that if she tells anybody, she will be really whipped. Throughout the sexualized assault, Turner cries and pleads her innocence. When the beating ends, the signs of distress are all too evident for the police officers, and they tell her, fix up, wipe your eyes. And then under the pretext that perhaps she's actually still hiding the money, the officers then order her to expose her breasts so that they can conduct a full examination in case that's where she's hidden the money. After the ordeal, Turner is driven back home by the same people who victimized her, who then enter her home with her and then search her property, obviously without a warrant. Although terrified and highly vulnerable to further police brutality, Turner refused to be silent. She armed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, from now on that will be referred to as SNCC, that is a local student-led civil rights organization in the 60s. She arms them with a sworn statement which details this assault. And the organization used that as evidence of anti-Black terrorism in the state. Turner also braved a legal system that would brand her a liar by virtue of her race and gender. She testified before the district attorney, who just refused to launch an investigation, just believed it was a lie. Local Mississippi civil rights leaders, you'll probably recognize this name, Megan Evers, Aaron Henry, they also mobilized on behalf of Turner. And they pushed for an indictment for police brutality from a federal grand jury, and they want to do that outside of Clarksdale, about 60 miles in a neighboring state. This too actually is unsuccessful. So at the time, civil rights activists used Turner's incident as part of an archive of evidence demonstrating police brutality against Black communities across the South. There is little mention of Turner in the civil rights scholarship. There are, however, fleeting references to this particular assault. And so, what is often omitted from this narrative is how Turner herself interpreted this. Indeed, 3 years later, in 1965, Turner testifies again about the sexualized beating and says that she believes this was an explicit reprisal against her attempts to register people to vote. So Turner's experience was not uncommon in the Jim Crow South. Indeed, in the 1960s, Southern law enforcers continued to draw on the lawless traditions of enslavement in order to control Black populations. So today I want to examine with you the intersections of civil rights activism, incarceration, and sexual violence against specifically women and girls. This isn't to say that men and boys were not subjected to sexual attacks, they certainly were. My research, however, focuses on narratives of girls and women So there are stories and narratives from men who talk about various forms of abuse, from threats to burn off genitalia to actual rape. So what these narratives tell us is that during the Black freedom movement, male and females began to just widen the scope of white violence, and that's perhaps what I want to do today. We know about some of the typical forms of violence and repression, voter right repression, but it's just to broaden that scope, and that's what men and women were doing actually in the 1960s. So in April 1960, civil rights activist Len Holt appealed to the members of a largely youth-based civil rights movement to, and I quote, go to jail in the hundreds and thousands. The Southern jail, with its deep connections to police brutality and extra-legal violence, was an extremely dangerous space and very volatile for African Americans. So the call to participate in what are called jailings was a decision that took a tremendous amount of courage and bravery, because one, it meant allowing yourself to be arrested and jailed. Two, refusing bail as an act of non-cooperation with the Southern white power structure, which also allowed activists to place pressure on local and federal authorities, and also just avoid the costly need to raise bail bonds. The jail no bail strategy is central to civil rights movement history, and as thousands of female activists committed to going to jail for civil disobedience, white police officers and jailers attempted to undermine their politics, often through sexual mistreatment and violence, which left women and girls particularly vulnerable to an enormous repertoire of sexualized violations. And these include, and I won't cover them all, sexual comments and threats, sexual intimidation, voyeurism, strippings, sexualized beatings is the one I described, abuse of search authority, medical malpractice, molestations, and rape. Just as antebellum practices of rape and sexual exploitation against black women and girls served to strengthen white slave owners' economic and social power.
What do you mean by voyeurism?
Where there is perhaps some kind of a sexual, it's watching. So it's perhaps what a peeping Tom will do, watching people for a sexual fulfillment.
Okay.
So, just as I said, just as slave owners use these tactics to strengthen their economic and social power, we're seeing that in the 1960s, actual sexual violence is also useful in strengthening the Jim Crow system, but also trying to dismantle and disrupt this movement. Prevalent beliefs, such as one Southern politician declared in the early 1900s, was that, and I quote, "There's no such thing as a virtuous color girl over the age of 14." So it gives you an idea of how they, thought of. We often say black women, but we need to understand that this sexualization begins actually in girlhood. And 50 years later, famed civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer laments that a black woman's body is never hers alone. So these pervasive beliefs of black female promiscuity dangerously intersected with the civil rights movement, and in particular with this protest method known as the jailing. However, sexual mistreatment often began during street demonstrations, so that's where it starts and it carries on and continues into the jail. So for instance, according to the Medical Committee of Human Rights, which was formed to provide medical assistance to civil rights workers during 1964 Mississippi Freedom Project, police officers frequently, and I quote, pulled up women's dresses and fondled their breasts. This is happening during street demonstrations, just prior to arrest. Likewise, Len Holt recalled in protest in Danville, Virginia, and this was in 1963, and I quote, that women had been beaten between their thighs on their buttocks and on their breasts. So we're seeing police officers deliberately targeting what we might see as sexualized parts of the body. I think when we see those civil rights pictures, when we see that footage of young people, young girls demonstrating on the streets, and of course we really admire their courage, those pictures, there's a limitation to them, but we need to also think about how these young people were being arrested. What types of experiences did they have? And through my research, I'm seeing that they're highly sexualized. And in fact, not so long ago, I watched a film about the London riots in 2011, and in which a young protester said nearly the same thing. She said, you know, we were getting arrested and police actually, they target specific body parts. So this is not a practice that is gone, but often it's not something that's captured in the media or talked about. Let me tell you a little bit about my research before I move on. A lot of my dissertation was about this incident, which is the Leesburg Stockade jailing, which took place in 1963. There are obviously thousands of civil rights jailings, specifically in the early 60s. What is perhaps slightly unique about this particular jailing is that it was caught on camera. A activist photographer, Danny Lyon, who is Jewish, was sent to this location to secretly take pictures. So if you look here, you'll see this is actually the broken glass of prison, and he's actually put his camera up by the window to take a picture. So I'm going to talk a bit about this jailing, but I won't actually focus on this case. But let me tell you that at the height of this jailing, 36 black girls between the ages of 9 and 16 were incarcerated in this space. It's a single cell. The girls, at the moment, you can see that there aren't any beds in the background. These girls protested, and in response to their protest inside this jail during their incarceration, which lasted 6 weeks, the beds and all the mattresses were removed. So they were now forced to sleep on the concrete floor. You can see that there is, a lot of trash and rubbish behind them. Indeed, this cell was an abandoned building. Police officers and jailers were just looking to warehouse young people, get them off the streets from protesting. All the jails are filled up, and so they were literally just looking for buildings to house people for the summer, because school was out, young people were protesting, and they needed to get kids off the street and locked up for the whole summer. And many of these girls actually were in this space for 6 weeks, the entire summer holiday. So this building was abandoned, it was dilapidated. There was no plumbing, it just didn't work. And so young people were forced to actually defecate in the cell and to find parts of the cell. They designated a mattress in which they would relieve themselves. None of their waste material was removed from the cell for 6 weeks. There was also no running water. This was it. A tap that drips. The water's actually rusty and brown. Young people were bought 3 hamburgers a day to actually eat. And so there were vomiting. You've got the waste material from defecation. But you also have, these are young girls who are on their periods. And in fact, we find that girls had to improvise, many of them just ripping their dresses to actually make homemade sanitary towels. One of the girls that was actually locked up in the stockade for 6 weeks was Carol Barner. She describes herself as a strong-willed and bull-headed girl. So she was just 13. And so I was able to interview her in Georgia. And I asked her, we discussed, about the risks of civil rights activism. I think one of the questions a lot of people ask were, why would parents let their kids be involved? And perhaps that's something we can discuss later. So I asked her, what did you think of the risks? Did you know what the risks were? She said, we knew before we got in the march that you could be killed, you could be beat, or you could go to jail. you was told that. It was your choice to go on the marches. However, the potential sexual risks of participating in jail-bound demonstrations, Barner reflected, I didn't even think of that. As a child, you heard about rape. You didn't think rape like you would get raped or anything. I just thought about getting beat, jailed, and killed. So already we're seeing an interesting narrative that's building up in which adults are counselling and talking to young people about the risks and openly talking about the fact that you may indeed be murdered for participation, but we're seeing an absence of the risks that are sexual. Sexual violence, actually, in relation to the movement was really publicised, and it wasn't exactly incorporated, not formally, into training sessions. But on occasion, the black press, and I stress this was the black press at the time, the white press are not particularly interested in these types of stories. They did, often in response to female-led activism, and we're going to talk a bit about that later, they did expose the sexual risks that women and girls faced in the movement. So here's an example of 1963 newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier. It's an African-American newspaper, in which you'll see that top story, girls sittings abused sexually in Dixie jails. The two women on each side, on this side we have Dr. Dorothy Height, who I'm going to talk about later. On the other side we have Jean Noble, who was a professor at New York University. So, as you can see, Medgar Evers murders, it's probably a case that you actually know about. Medgar Evers, who was murdered. And so we can see how history has certainly left its mark in the case of Medgar Evers' murder. But this other story, which in 1963 shares the front page, is seemingly lost. It's not a story we know anymore. And it's something to think about how history is made and what types of history we remember and what other types of history we actually forget. But I'll talk a little bit more about these two really important women and their activism, specifically in relation to sexual violence. So I spoke to a man who was a volunteer back in the early 60s. He was a volunteer for SNCC. And I also asked him about, well, what do these training sessions for young people look like? And he told me SNCC, which is the civil rights organization, made no effort to say to girls, you do this, you do that. We just taught strategy, how to protect yourself if you were being attacked. We'd gone through some training about how to cover your head if you were being hit. Those were the things irrespective of sex and race. So here we're already seeing how talking about strategy becomes this very gender-neutral thing. So I asked them, as a follow-up, do you think girls actually faced any particular vulnerabilities? Oh yes. Emphatically replying, oh yes. If you go back in history, black women have always been a sexual target for white men. And even in the movement, when these young girls were being locked up for a period of time, they would come back with stories of being molested. So I asked James to talk a little bit more about these claims. So he says, in some instances, some would say that the men took advantage of them, undressed them, and would lay on them and do their business and get up. So those kinds of things were never followed up or taken to a level where the law was brought in, because frequently it was people associated with the law that was doing it. So despite the testimonies of girl protesters who were molested while incarcerated, James Westbrook contends that there was little recourse available to black communities. The claim that jailhouse assaults were never followed up is vastly overstated, however. In many cases, women made sure that sexual violence against activists were followed up. And one of the most significant leaders of this political endeavour was Dr. Dorothy Height, who organised the first institutional campaign against jailhouse violence in the early to mid-1960s. So we talk a little bit about Dr. Dorothy Height, again, another figure who seems to be somewhat lost to history, but some of you may actually recognize this woman or may know of her work. She was present at the March of Washington, which we know very, very well, but no woman was allowed to be given a platform to speak. So she simply stood next to Martin Luther King on that famous day, but wasn't given the opportunity to talk. So I want to talk a bit about her now. She's a favorable leader of the Black freedom movement, Dr. Dorothy Height. She brought this uncanny ability to organize and to speak and to push for change on a local, state, and federal level. She'll long be remembered as a pioneer and architect of numerous civil rights movements, and they literally span from anti-lynching to HIV and AIDS awareness. So it gives you a sense of this long life that she lived. Indeed, she died at the age of 98. I had the honor to interview her when she was 96. She saw and fought for it all. So when she was buried in 2010, it was actually President Obama who gave her eulogy, quite fitting for a woman of her stature, in which he said, "This woman made it possible for Michelle and me to be here as President and First Lady." And that is certainly no exaggeration. However, what's less known is her courageous efforts to eradicate jailhouse violence against female civil rights workers during her tenure at the National Congress of Negro Women, NCNW. Dedicated to exposing the problem and protecting women and girls, Height organized conferences and made media appearances that signaled a fresh candor about the extent of sexual violence. This is the 60s, so talking about issues of rape and sexual violence is unusual. So Dorothy Height is not mincing words and is talking about rape in the 1960s and rape against girls and women. So one example of this would be in 1963. It's a New York radio station, again accompanied by G. Noble, who was on the newspaper article. And she talks about, and I quote, "the brutality and sexual abuse of freedom demonstrators in prisons in the South." And she says, "Charges of rape, sexual abuse, and other indignities have been reported by black and white female activists in Mississippi and Georgia during a secret meeting which was held in May 1963. So what Height explains to the delegates during the secret meeting is that they needed to come away with a sense that, you know what, as women, this is one thing we can do. We can organize and we can end this. And she talks about how these horrible atrocities, to use her words, seem invented, particularly against women and girls. So she's on the radio station talking about this, and she's asked by the presenter, "Well, do you know that this is a fact? I mean, how do you know for sure this is happening?" Dorothy Height's quite clear. "Yes, we do. We know it's happening because we've had first-hand reports from women themselves. They were raped by attendants in the jail. Both Negro and white young women who were arrested had been subjected to internal examinations at the hands of male attendants there and under very unsanitary conditions." Noble follows up by saying, "As a woman, I can think of no greater indignity than rape or sexual exposure or unsanitary conditions." And she told the radio audience, "There have been lots of rapes, and most of the girls have been admitted to, and most of the girls who are in Mississippi jails have been subjected to unmedical vaginal examinations." And she says it's one of the many efforts on the parts of people in jails to discourage people from participating in social protests, and it's not going to work. Now I'm talking about internal examinations. I just want to emphasize just how intrusive this type of examination is. It's the pelvic examination. So this would perhaps what would happen to a young girl, 10, 11, 12, teenagers, women, both black and white, who were arrested for perhaps attempting to enter a cinema through the white-only door, various civil disobediences, and they would be subjected to these types of examinations to do it under the grounds that perhaps they were hiding contraband. But the law says you need to have a reasonable suspicion that perhaps they're hiding contraband. And being arrested in a civil rights demonstration and perhaps being 10 years old, there is no reasonable suspicion. And so what people like Dorothy Height and Jean Noble are saying is that this is actually being used punitively. This is what the examination involves: somebody pushing their hand into the vagina to check for contraband. Now, this particular examination was being done by men on women. This is an examination that should be done by a female matron. It was being done by jailers, people who had no kind of medical background. And in fact, there were cases reported by women and girls in which, if they wore gloves, many times they did not wear gloves, but if they wore gloves, they actually dipped the gloves into bleach before inserting it into these young protesters. You can see that this is tremendously intrusive and a huge sexual violation. And so these were being used as a standard and a way to get people off the street and to put them off civil rights activism. Dorothy Height says, this can't happen. And she organizes a conference, and she actually gets a number of faith-based women organizations together. So this gives you an idea of the 5 organizations she put together. She's actually the president of NCNW. And these are some of the other organizations. Approximately 75 women actually come together. And the women who are there are actually predominantly middle class and they're predominantly white women. But they assemble together as the Women's Inter-Organization Committee, known as WIC. And they decide that they need to produce a charter of concern for the protection of women and girls in an era of social change. That's the goal. For me, I feel that's quite a radical and really important goal that they set forward. That these women said together, we're going to work in an interfaith, interracial context to actually protect women and girls who are actually fighting for freedom. During this opening session, Height explicitly announced how urgent this work is. And she positioned jailhouse sexual violence along the right to vote. Now, this is not a narrative that you're hearing in mainstream civil rights conversations. We're hearing about the right to vote, equal accommodations. But Height is saying the sexual protection of people who are demonstrating is as important as the right to vote. And we should be equally protesting that as well. Again, another radical step. The keynote speech was actually given by, the keynote opening speech was given by a Mrs. Tilley. This was a white Southern woman who worked for the Southern Regional Council. She argued that women had limited financial and political power, indeed they did. She proposed that women's power was historically rooted in the ability to act as watchdogs, which could be used to influence the men who are responsible for jails. This discourse is coming out of turn of the century reformist discourse where women were thought of as the better sex, that we could uplift men. And so we see a lot of activities in the Victorian era. So some of this discourse where women are the ones who can take the moral lead, that we can guide men to live better lives, that discourse is coming up in the 1960s. And what's interesting is that immediately some of the black female delegates see an issue with this particular discourse because it doesn't quite work out when we put a racial lens on it. And one of those women was this woman, Amelia Boynton. She was a civil rights leader in Selma, in the Selma movement. And she says, well, let me just describe what's actually happening in Selma. She says, you know what, any white man over the age of 21 who wants a gun and who wants to join the sheriff department can join. There are so many arrests and so many activism that the police department are desperate to recruit. And so they are actually just swearing in regular people off the street. If you want to join the police force, you can come in and you are sworn in and you are now a police officer on that day. No training, and you got issued a gun. So these are the types of people now that we're seeing in the police department because they just need bodies in order to arrest these types of bodies. And so that's what Boynton is now talking about. People are being pulled off the streets. These are perhaps not the people that we can negotiate and reason with. And she says, you know what? The women in these jails are extremely vulnerable. She says the matrons don't take care of them, and the black community workers are actually physically prevented from inspecting jails. So this idea that we can go in and talk to sheriffs and negotiate and inspect jails, she's saying that's not something we're going to be able to do when you're on the ground. However, I would also want to point out that black women weren't just talking about the oversights, they were also offering their strategies and how they were resisting. And their perspectives from being on the front line. And so they talked about stories that maybe we don't think about in terms of resistance. For one, smuggling sanitary towels into jails. It's the kind of thing that women are going to think about. That's not going to be on a man's agenda as a point of resistance. Lawyers, perhaps, or medical people who were allowed to somehow get through the doors, or people who could pass as white, just smuggling in sanitary towels in their bags so they could get those into jails. A crucial form of resistance. Another black woman talked about this phone call, and I'll describe that to you, in which they literally bombard a police station when someone's been arrested, particularly if they think they're vulnerable to violence or getting disappeared. Call the police station over and over and over and talk about this person. Are you holding this person? We know you have this person. The police have to answer every single call. They can't just put the phone off the hook because it could be an emergency. So it's letting the police know that you're under scrutiny. We know you have this person in there. Bombarding the police station with calls all day long. These are the kind of strategies that black women were coming up with. But for all this expert testimonies, perhaps the most powerful stories actually came from young people themselves. And there was a panel of just young girls who talked about their jail experiences. I just want to share the narrative of Joanne Christian and her three younger sisters who were all active in the movement. Frequently, they were the targets of police violence. They were subjected to numerous arrests. And Joanne herself, who was only 14 years old, had actually, up until age 14, had been arrested 13 times for various forms of civil disobedience. So she talks about her sister, Navette, who was arrested, and she describes how she was put in a cell on her own. And these are her words, that the police officers made passes at her. Often, as I read before, where we talked about James talking about women saying men were lying on them and doing their business, we're seeing that the words rape or sexual molestation are being used. So we're seeing euphemisms being used. And here's another one. So they're making passes, police officers are making passes at a 12-year-old girl. And she says to the audience, you just can't imagine what they did to her. I think it's important for us to think about that experience of what it means to be in a cell on your own and having people make passes at you, using the language of courtship, but we really need to interpret that and to understand that that is about violence and specifically about sexual violence. It was only decades later that actually Joanne talked a little bit more about this incident. And she says that her sister was actually touched inappropriately. Indeed, such wounds remained with Christian even in her adulthood. She said many decades later, I try not to think about the horrible things that happened to me in the movement. I've never shared some of them with my own children because these incidents are just too destructive. My own research has not only uncovered some little or unknown incidents of jailhouse sexual violence against female activists, but also their courage and their resistance. I think that's a really important part of this story. So I just want to share that with you before ending. Annette Jones White, she's a student leader, young woman. She was incarcerated in 1961. And she describes how police officers brought in, and I quote, a dozen white men into the cell to look us over. White remembers that for 15 minutes, white men simply walked around the cell looking at them. It literally is like a market. Police officers invite their guests and they look around. So an older woman who was incarcerated with these protesters understands what perhaps might be happening here. She says, women, we're going to have to defend ourselves tonight. That's a possibility. So what she instructs them to do is to save the stale cornbread, which is actually part of their jailhouse meals, because they were hard, and they said, you know, if these men come back, perhaps we can use them as rocks. And what we're seeing is women and girls having to come up with on-the-spot resistance to possible sexual attacks. Likewise, Sandra Mansfield is actually the cousin of Carol Barner, who I shared some of her thoughts with you earlier. She was in that same stockade, which I showed you the pictures. She was 12 years old. She recounts an incident in which a white man outside of the cell threw a snake through the window. All the glass was shattered. I told you it was an abandoned building. He actually throws a snake. We later to find out it's a rattlesnake, poisonous and dangerous. He throws the snake into the cell. So, in recounting this story, she says a long, tall white policeman, or someone who worked with the police department, was actually was watching the girls from outside of the stockade. But that, and she says, he weren't supposed to be there. But he was peeping in through that window at night and stuff. And crucially, what she says later on is, so we saved up some pee and we threw it at him, and that's when the snake came in later. So we have an example of voyeurism, of a man who they think is part of the police department, standing outside at night, Mansfield, and we need to be really attentive to where there are admissions. But we know he's staring at them and stuff. We don't know what the stuff is. But again, it's really important to understand this is a 60s context, and that at some level we need to work hard, we need to interpret. What does and stuff mean? We don't know. It could possibly mean masturbation. Someone is out there at night watching girls. And these are girls, as I told you, between 9 and 16. So we see this form of resistance that just never gets old for me. I think it's great. But this action, I think it's important to see that these girls just refuse to be the passive subjects of a peep and tom. And much like the strategy that we saw in Albany when the men walked around the cell, we see that women and girls, where they gathered cornbread, here we see them actually creating this homespun ammunition, and on this occasion it's urine, which they used to actually literally disrupt the gaze of a voyeur. And so it's important to emphasize that this task of collecting and throwing urine isn't some kind of spontaneous response made up on the spot. Rather, the girls became acclimatized to the conditions of incarceration, and they learned to recognize new resources and also to work together. That together, collective resistance was how they were going to perhaps avoid various types of sexual mistreatment. This snake incident actually led to a major rebellion in the stockade, which I quickly hinted to, and again I'll just briefly go over that. Again, girls located a source in the stockade. It turns out there were some unlit matches on the cell floor, and they were able to use those matches to actually burn what they saw as the most offensive objects, which were these mattresses that they had to use in order to relieve themselves. So they burned those mattresses down. Indeed, it's interesting because the white press labeled this rebellion as a jailhouse riot. We often see forms of black resistance. You quickly become labeled as riots and very destructive forms of behavior. For me, I see this as an act of self-defense. But they labeled it to be a riot, and they constructed these girls as being unruly and primitive and being where they're really part of a non-violent movement. Look, they're trying to burn down the very cell that they're in. There is, of course, no mention that there is no toilets, no running water, and that they're subjected to a number of physical and sexual attacks. In fact, and as I say, this application, which I see as self-defense in the face of violence, was indicative of widespread support amongst black communities for self-defense strategies. Often we start to think of black power movements being where self-defense was encouraged and embraced. And that's absolutely not the case. In the rural South, you weren't going to catch anyone who didn't have a gun. And in fact, having a philosophical commitment to non-violence, but also being prepared to defend yourselves, they coexisted for many people without a problem, and they didn't see that as being a conflict. So there isn't this periodization where suddenly black people are thinking, oh, we should defend ourselves. This is throughout the movement. It's actually part of non-violent protest. So to conclude, at times to be friendly and courteous in the face of abuse, as many were instructed during these meetings, showing a form of black respectability was absolutely crucial to successes during the movement. They didn't want violence on the streets. So young people were instructed, you need to show that you're respectable, you were raised right. And so to give that impression was absolutely crucial to movement successes. But it also left some women and girls uniquely vulnerable to any number of mishandlings and actually ferocious attacks, as a growing body of evidence suggests. Indeed, injuries, internal and physical and emotional, did not stop many girls. Many girls came back out. It stopped some though. So I contend that these women and girls set a powerful example for future generations and activists. So that's the end of the talk, but I definitely want to just open it up for discussion rather than Q&A. Your thoughts, and indeed connecting it to what we're seeing today, even to the events this week, I think are really crucial. And I'd really like to see how you see how this research is significant for our contemporary moment, but also how it's important for us to reevaluate this history, particularly as it is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and there are several other anniversaries, the Emancipation Proclamation, 150 years, and just talking about how we might actually mark those events. We've seen Hollywood take a stab at it with Lincoln and Django Unchained, but how are we going to define those really important anniversaries in that history for ourselves? And how do we perhaps shift away from a very heavy king popular narrative to other actors and a lot of forgotten women and girls? So, let's open up the floor.
Before you do that though, can we just give Dr. Althea Miller a round of applause? Thank you. I'd actually like to just feed some of my thoughts and then maybe form them into a question of some kind. I was really thinking about the psychology of the history. The where it's the heart of a traumatic experience such as that is taking place. And in terms of the training that these women, girls, whoever, will put on the front line, whether part of the training, the fact that it didn't involve strategies for obvious ways that you could have done some self-defense training against being attacked by men, whether this had something to do with the fact that they were most obviously being trained by men, and then what were those men, what were their consciousness like in terms of thinking about the female and the female body? Because one of the things I know in our African Caribbean communities is still that the difficulty, the psychology of dealing with that aspect of sexual violence. So the focus might be on domestic violence and so on, but what happens when it's sexual violence? I'm always concerned that the man, or even the woman that doesn't want to go there, is because either they've experienced it, or, as the male, perpetrated it in some form. So, although yes, this is the freedom movement, who is to say that sometimes those were very, very difficult things for men to broach in terms of their own gender constructions and their own participation in acts of sexualized violence. So I suppose I'm really wondering whether it was something like that, whether the psychology of the violence and the trauma still was related to the fact of the gender aspect, that men hadn't really consciously thought about that impact in any way. So I wondered if you might just talk about it. It wasn't really like a question, but I suppose it's just something I was trying to raise. And just to know, I think I wanted to just say this, that I happened to meet, Angela Davis over the weekend. And she was talking about how she's doing political prison, she's trying to show the rights of that. She was talking about how there's a growing number of women being in America, being imprisoned, incarcerated. So how are those kinds of narratives filtering out? So maybe you can say something about the current situation in terms of women being incarcerated. If you know anything even here, what about the situation here? In terms of, because obviously there were black rights, civil rights, demonstration protests here when we were being arrested. I remember one of Olive Morris where she was arrested and probably subjected to, some abuse. I'll stop there though, but
No, and on some level I'll throw that back out as the fastest growing prison population today. So we hear a lot about the incarceration of black males. Now, of course, the numbers of black women incarcerated do not begin to compare with black males, but they are the fastest growing population. I think that's key. So when we're talking about prisons or the prison industrial complex, we really need to be thinking about African American women in that, and not simply the crazy and overwhelming numbers of black men who are currently incarcerated in the United States. So that's key to say. The psychology, that's a tough one, so that's why I'm going to rely on all of you lot here to perhaps engage and flesh that out a little bit. What I will give is a little bit of context, which some of you will be aware of. And there probably is a decision that we are collectively going to fight for racial justice. That at this point, gender is going to take a backseat, that we have come together on terms of race. Within that, women are always aware that there needs to be gender rights and sexual rights. And so women are actually the backbone of the movement. So it is always there. And that's why women's liberation comes out of the ways. It comes out of the civil rights movement. A lot of the white women who are part of the civil rights movement go on to develop those same strategies, those same modes of working, which then later becomes, as we recognize, as a women's liberation or feminist movements. they all come out of civil rights movement and the ways in which women specifically worked. So for women, there isn't this race or gender. It absolutely was always intersectional. So that's key. But this is the 1960s, and we are at a time before the women's movement in which rape is not defined as a crime of violence. It's still defined as a crime of sex and sexual gratification. So there's an issue to talk about crimes of rape, because you could be seen to feed into this discourse of sex. So if you publicize rape attacks against black women, many people in the public are going to interpret that as, these are sex scandals. And you do know as black women are quite promiscuous and they're hypersexualized, so perhaps what did they do to invite these attacks? Perhaps they're seducing these guards while they're in jails. So there's a problem, because that's the way you're seen as hypersexual, and rape is not at that point defined as a crime of violence. So do you publicize a lot about sexual crimes, which could then feed into that public discourse, like, well, I told you they were hypersexualized. Every 2 minutes is another story about them. But that is not to say that activists, male and female, did not understand that at times they would mobilize around certain rapes or sexual assaults. And they did that for Betsy Turner. So they were not all like, oh, we can't talk about that. But it is selective, and it is at times where the black press decides what stories to be talked about. And for men to make decisions on, well, which cases might we flag up and how often might we do that. But there needs to be a challenging of the narrative that there is hypersexuality in the black community. So there is no strategy to let's really target this, even though it's widespread and it's happening across the communities. On some level, there needs to be the protection of the actual people. There needs to be the protection of the idea of what it is to be a black woman or a girl in the South. But then there is also, you know what, is it as important as a story of murder? And so we get stories of rapes, which are not seen as important. If I say the name Emmett Till, I'm pretty certain everybody knows what happened to Emmett Till. And there's a reason why at times black communities would mobilize around a murder, a killing, a shooting, a lynching, in a way that the crime of rape did not allow them to mobilize. So there is a selection. But there are also numerous examples of acts of violence against male activists which were elevated to be of particular importance and became national narratives in the ways that perhaps stories of rape and abuse were simply local stories. But also just not really knowing what to do with those narratives. And I think that might feed into what you're saying, psychology of masculinity. But also that tension between being able maybe to talk about interracial sexual violence, but not being able to talk about intra-racial sexual violence, which of course exists at that time as it does now. And that just being an uncomfortable space to occupy in a way that, you know what, let's just press forward for voter rights. We want to be able to go into this restaurant. We want to be able to do various things, and gender rights are something that perhaps if we get our rights as black people, you know, will come later. But there could be people who are like interested in psychology and that angle at the back.
Yeah, I think really fast, so I might not make any sense when I speak, but I think it was just building on what you were saying about present day. I work for the probation service, so in terms of conviction rates and that kind of thing, I see a lot of what's going on. Even in Britain alone, the conviction rates of black women are rising, and they're rising pretty fast. What I specialise in is domestic violence, but I do see what happens, you know, sort of in the probation community. Also, I wanted to touch on probably the lack of addressing sexual violence in today's society when it comes to black women. We're just, we live in a patriarchal society, and even up till, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was 1996, up to 1996, rape in marriage was not recognised.
Yeah.
So you could rape your wife and you wouldn't be convicted in this country. I think we're sort of dealing with the fallout of that. We're moving forwards, but I don't feel like we've moved forwards enough. What my job is to do is kind of work with men who have perpetrated violence and abuse against their partners. And what I've seen quite often is we do a module based on sexual respect. And whenever we touch on that module, there's always a massive sort of energy of resistance inside the room. Also, I think another issue is what is recognised as sexual abuse and rape. So for a lot of women, I work with women as well, they don't realise that what's happened to them is rape. Or quite often, and coming back to something you said, I only came on the tail end of your talk, I apologise, but you spoke about making sure what's going, or putting out that kind of persona that what's happening in the black community, where we were raised right and there's nothing going on in our community and everything's fine. What you find quite often in this is the men that I deal with as well, one of the reluctances they have in the, when it comes to speaking about it is, I don't want, white people, or, we live in Britain, white people think we're over-sexual already and, we're sexual predators. And in speaking about it and addressing it, it merely kind of feeds into the perception that people have already. Also, black rape isn't put on the news. You find in terms of, when white women are victims of rape, quite often it does make the news, it does make the statistics. That doesn't always happen with black women. And I've seen that myself, going to a lot of feminist meetings and knowing a lot of women in general, they've experienced rape and, serious offences that probably should have made the news, but you find it swept under the carpet. It's what is palatable for British news quite often, and black women, unfortunately, aren't palatable. That's just how it is. I don't know if that expands on anything or gives you any information, but...
Yeah. Can I just add to that? Sorry, can I just add to that? Yeah, because I just kind of feel like I have a bit of a similar experience when I work with young women who are victims of sexual exploitation and violence through gangs. And one of the things that interests me about your point is that often I feel that, particularly for the young black women who are experiencing it, it's the mould in which we work with them. So there isn't a kind of cultural lens attached to the way that we may work with the young women. So it doesn't understand that as a black woman or a young black woman that there are different issues for you when you go through those sorts of things. So it's not just about gender sensitive for a black woman, it's about gender sensitivity and identity issues. And so for me that's a big problem. So often you will get lots of young black women who will come, who will talk about their experiences, but they're dealt with very differently to young white women, or even, I guess in some respects, to young Asian women, because there's kind of like the new racism. So people are dealing with their issues very differently, and I think that that's quite an important addition to the way that we work with young black women who are going through those types of things.
Well, myself, I want to go to the civil rights movements in general, because if I compare to the type of narrative you just narrated in relation to violence against women in jails, if I compare that to what I experienced in Germany, it's just because Germany is much more. Alright, I've learned the civil rights movement is almost like monitoring in general, in the sense that the goals they set out to achieve has actually been squeezed the carpet, as you just mentioned, that the number of Azanians or blacks in jail has actually been going up. And even my own research also did show that in comparison, despite the fact that the Azanians in America have very high positions in politics, still the number of blacks in jail is very high in relation to their European counterparts. So in that respect, what do you have to share with us about the civil rights movements, and if actually it is still as it's supposed to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. Many people ask, the civil rights movement failed? Were the gains that we achieved important? And I feel that debate was even happening in the 60s. It's a very particular type of Martin Luther King that were given, but even to come up towards his murder, he understood that there needed to be this economic shift, that we needed to start thinking in terms of how people are economically oppressed, and that would be across racial lines. To talk about poor people, to talk about welfare, not simply where I can eat in a restaurant, but those economic oppressions. And so, and you know, he was, at that time, he was assassinated. He had this movement, the Poor People's Movement. And so there was this shift that we would need to build alliances. And these would have to be informed by gender and class as well as race. And that political gains are not enough. That there needed to be economic power within the black community as well.
Yeah, we talk about civil rights, but to a lot of people on both sides, it is literally a war. And it's been in the media recently that sex is used as a weapon of war. It's happening in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and those areas, Congo, Rwanda. It happened when one side comes to dominate another, the first victims are the women, and they rape the women. And that went on through the enslavement of African people, went on during the Roman invasions around different continents, when the Vikings and Saxons invaded. The first victims were women, and it was rape all the time. So it seems there's a pattern that when one society wants to dominate another, the first victim is the women, and it is rape is the first weapon used.
It's a very effective tool.
I think Francis Cresswell touched on this a bit in his papers. Is that when the woman is targeted, the woman is the first teacher of the infant, and what Francis Cresswell was saying is that the women should stop teaching young black boys, not to fight against their oppressor, because when women are raped, when they're violated, the first thing they want to do is protect the infant. And what they'll say to them is, don't fight against them. Don't fight because you'll be murdered. And the first thing they want to do is protect them. So what I think and what Francis Question was touching on is that women are attacked physically and verbally and sexually so that when they have the newborn, they'll encourage them not to fight.
So can I just ask a question? In relation to the civil rights movement, so the violence, sexual violence, did any cases come where they dealt with retrospectively, any of them at all?
Question. Well, no. Through legal means.
Perhaps through legal means.
No.
I know even that years later, they could have pointed out the perpetrators. So was anything done?
The system would have been, I imagine, the whole, sorry, not cut me, but like Nia was saying, that it's war. So what I'm understanding, what you've said, is that you could just, anybody, as long as we needed people to fight the war. So we needed soldiers. So you're not going to put a soldier, on trial because the soldier is carrying out the war. So I don't know whether that...
But you also said that, a lot of the violence, reports were dismissed. And then that kind of, in my mind, connect to and the treatment, they weren't treated that badly. So everything was made to look as if it wasn't, the truth was kind of taken away, put aside. So with the photograph that guy took through the window, surely that was, in my mind, the start to say, look, something isn't right. So what happened to that photograph, and when it went public, and when did it go public? What happened then?
That's a good question. Just to say, it's not until 1971 that we see the first conviction of a jailer who raped a black woman in jail finally get convicted. Since 1971, that so-called barrier is actually broken. That's Joanne Little, and you can Google that story. Really important story. So we're not seeing any convictions for jailhouse rapes in the 60s.
But that's because with the Joanne Little case, there was a campaign. It was a massive campaign. So, and maybe that's why that conviction.
Exactly, and it's about mobilisation. But this Leesburg Stockade jailing also led to mobilisation and a huge campaign too. So these pictures are sent to a senator who raises it on the Senate floor and talks about this particular jailing. It's probably because of those photographs that eventually the girls are released. But it's not just the photographs. The black community in the area where these girls lived stopped shopping in certain places. So there was economic pressure on white businesses. So we were not going to shop in their businesses anymore. And young people actually did a school boycott. This was really effective. They told other school people, do not go back to school at the end of summer. Don't go back to school until all of the young people can come back to school. Now that was just a huge headache for the authorities, to have masses of young people who were just walking out of schools or not going to school anymore.
Is that black and white?
This is black. Yes, these are the black schools where like no kids go to school, and they were actually being encouraged to stay at home. So there was a tension because there are people are like, no, my kids should go to school, and others saying, pull your kids out of school. So we're seeing pressure on education authorities, we're seeing economic boycotts. It's in government, of Congress, that this story's been talking about. And there's a press conference, and all these photographs are at the press conference. There are also other incidents that happened at the time. 3 male activists have been arrested and are facing the death penalty. They have overcharged them, which is, you'll know about that tactic, overcharging for incitement to overthrow the government, which carries a death penalty. They were participants in the civil rights demonstration. And so that's a huge case to get those activists out of jail who are now facing the death penalty. And also, a black man had his leg broken by 3 police officers during a demonstration. And then these girls are locked up. So all these stories are happening at the same time. They're also competing press space. Of course, the activists facing the death penalty is what takes up a lot of the press columns, and perhaps even in history is remembered far more than this particular jailing. But there are often competing stories, and activists are making decisions about what do we put forward. But they have these pictures, they're very compelling. So this was certainly a campaign around that. But that press conference took place after they were eventually released. So there definitely was pressure from certain places, and a lot of the white press didn't talk about sexual abuse, but they started to isolate this town as being, you're just like, this is a different America, as a white newspaper said. And which you see today sometimes. You'll get certain areas of certain types of people like, they're not really like us. You know, that's trash. They're not really like us. And so we saw that in the white press, where it was like, okay, you lot are really crazy because white America doesn't believe this, and this is not how we act. And that's just you lot in the South. You are backward doing your kind of thing. So we saw this isolation. And in a way, therefore, that conversation that needed to happen on a national level, and white America really assessing their values, didn't happen, because now this was just a really odd Southern thing.
Do you think it may be a mindset problem that we have within our community? Because we're talking about rape and so forth, and rape is it's just a power dimension. Anybody that's in power, they're going to do certain things that they can get away with. And from a sexual point of view, men will look at it as slightly differently to women. That's the way it's always going to be, I'm afraid. But within our community, for a long time, incest has been swept under the carpet. Now, you may say things have changed over the years, but I think things have gone worse in a way, because now we've got MTV and other programs like that, where sexualization of our youngsters is there for all to see. Now, what are we doing about that? We should be having zero tolerance. We should be changing our mindset collectively, because you mentioned about the strategies that they took on. We have to become more sensible about strategies that we can use collectively. Now, these type of lectures are a starting point, but it's how do we educate and get through to other people so that they can see that we do have a power, and it's not just about acquiescing, but developing strategies which are more passive but more effective. What can we do about those things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would just start off by saying, rape and incest is absolutely nothing particular to our community or particular to black communities. This sweeping under the carpet, we can see in all cultures and all communities. There is nothing, absolutely nothing specific about rape and incest in the black community. So I'd say that number one. But I think what you raised to say, there's racialized elements here that we really need to be plugged in. These types of violences, they play out differently through a racialized lens. So we need to be aware of that. That's how we're gonna begin to connect with, say, young women, young girls. What are the racial dynamics? While rape is not particular to a community, there are different factors, racialized factors, age, which inform and shape the way that we might be able to have a community discussion or that we might be able to intervene. And I think that's a really important question more than we have a particular issue. It's like, what are the racialized dynamics and how are they being played out racially and how do we navigate that? And I think there is some expertise here in the room. We can start to speak to that.
Sorry, I was just thinking about, the racialized angle of it. Because when I was talking about the psychology of the history and the psychology of the trauma, part of what I was really also getting at was the unprecedented fact of, the rape as a metaphor of Africa. And then within that, the actual rape that the women, the men who have suffered under that system, that is peculiar to Africans, and that has been perpetrated because it's part of a psychological trauma that just keeps perpetuating itself and being told it's not something, because it's so painful and it's so dark, that it's not simply, rape that, might be something that's disconnected from that history. It in terms of racializing it, it's very much connected to that history. And so I think we need to be aware of that, mindful of that in those times, this was war, and the war is still impacting psychologically on us. So I think that is really what I wanted to say about, the racialization of sexual violence.
Sexual violence at the time, I understand that everyone is agreeing it was war at that time, and because of the stigma attached to being rape and they kind of term it something else, I can understand the time. But to me, it seems that very little has changed. In terms of the men at the time, wanting a certain amount of freedom, but paying little attention to the sexual violence. Sexual violence itself is not as explicit in the open now as it is then, in the same way. But to me, it seems that black women are still being not physically hurt, but at the same time, so I'm trying to get the right words. Our image is still kind of being tainted and very sexualized. I'm trying to put it into the right, trying to link them together properly. So please bear with me. So it's not just really a case at the time they were just fighting this war and therefore couldn't deal with what I would say their women.
Yeah.
For some reason, I think the psychological treatment that they had to endure at that time, it kind of, I don't know, almost blanked their mind from this is what's happening. I don't know if it would become so commonplace that they couldn't even see that this is our babies, 9-year-old children that's being hurt. And today I see almost similar thing where in the music business, I still see black women being abused. The words itself, calling like whores and all these filthy names. Is it okay? I mean, we're still not being protected. We're still not being looked at. You are beautiful human beings who deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. One year I went to a library in Southgate, and in the library it was Black History Month, and I was looking to see what material they had out on the table, and to my disgust and horror, I was really annoyed. There was a book showing black women's the type of clothes that they wear. And it was the very, I mean, to me, they just walked down the street perhaps and just took photographs of particular women who were wearing very short, very tight skirts. And that was their fashion that they, showed that this is black women's fashion. Now, the way I saw a lot of black women that I associated with dress, they didn't wear, in everyday wear, perhaps just going to college or, in their jobs. I didn't see them wearing very low-cut dresses and tight skirts. And I think across all Europeans, as well as the black women, they also wear short skirts. But this was what was attributed to black women's fashion. So black women are still, in a way, being raped, in a different way, perhaps not physically, as in the homes as we know, but in the media, and it's allowed, it's still allowed to go on.
Oh, absolutely. I think it goes back to what you were saying. These things, they play out in very specific racial ways because there's a historical context. And you're right, today's image of black women is absolutely connected to that historical lens. I just recently wrote an article for Clutch magazine, it's a US online magazine, about Snoop lying now. Who knew? But he recently gave a Rolling Stone interview in which he talked about in 2003 he finally managed to do this thing which was his fantasy, which was basically to be a pimp and to run a bus of women, which he actually referred to as bitches, and had them, as he said, sell pussy for me and sell it to other athletes and famous men as well. And he was so proud of this, and that this had always been he said, since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a pimp. And this finally is like, I'm famous, I can actually do this now. And so he employed 10 hoes to follow him on a bus and pimp them out. And he even talks about sometimes he'd pretend to take the money from them, as a real pimp would do, but he'd let them have the money in the end. And then, as he said, he could just fuck them when he wanted to. That's his own words.
Yeah.
I'm sure he uses those words.
If you see the case of rape, the rape you just mentioned that is interracial or things like that. If you take the case of Germany, for example, almost 99% of German women were raped after the Second World War. It was a policy legitimized by the West and the Russians, that the Germans claiming to be pure should be totally brought out of their claims of being pure. So the West had to, rape German women, and the Russians also, that was their policy, to rape all German women to ensure that all of them would have children of different race. So it happened in every war. Even right now, it's the same story.
Well, yeah, it's been used all around the world, and obviously Jewish women during the Holocaust were also raped by Germans. And that, Syria was brought up, Bosnia, and we can literally go around the world and go completely through history to see how that is actually a political weapon. It's a political tactic.
It's a political weapon that's arising out of a particular mindset whereby women, as women are not constituted as being fully human beings.
Yeah.
They're the property of another class of being, those who are human, for want of a better way of putting it. So during a time of war, if women are, raped as part of the war strategy, it's a way of attacking male property. That's one of the dynamics of that whole. That's one of the dynamics of that strategy.
Absolutely.
Women are constituted as property.
Yeah.
In the same way that a piece of land is constituted as a piece of property.
To be owned, yeah.
Nations are constituted as pieces of property. So that's the connection,
Exactly. And of course, we come out of a history where we also were property. So you see how those histories intersect and where that leaves certain people super vulnerable.
I wondered in that.
Sorry, Neil's had his hand up for a little while. Because I'll try and facilitate when the hands go up like crazy. Yeah.
So the sister there, she touched on it a little bit. Is gangs and relationship relationship rape. It's an issue now that's being brought up in schools. So they're having not sex education anymore. It's called relationships. So that's being brought about, and they talk about rape within relationships. There was a spate back in the 90s. There was a program by Darcus Howe about gang rape. And there was a program on the BBC. It was well publicised. Everybody's in shock horror. All went quiet. And about 5 years ago, a well-known activist was on the radio show. A girl sent in an anonymous letter saying, you know what, she's been gang raped and she had no one to turn to. She doesn't know what to do. He got all angry. He goes, okay, well, let's do something about this. So he called me and a few other brothers and said, listen, let's do something about this. Let's have a meeting and let's do something. And one by one, they all dropped out. But I still have the Facebook group called Against Sexual Violence in the Black Community. It's still a Facebook group, but there's hardly anybody in there. So we keep on hearing about rape, but it's not like a wow, let's do something about this. It's like it's accepted. It's like the sister said as well. It's like the sister said. Some girls expect it, they accept it. It's like some girls, when I spoke to them earlier when we started this, they said it's normal. In a particular school in East London, another one in Brent, they said it's normal for girls to be felt up and raped in school premises. And I think Brent Police was the first police force to actually have a separate gang rape force. Disbanded now, but they took it so seriously in Brent that actually they had a separate force, about 2 officers, to specifically target gang rape. But it's not a wow factor anymore.
There absolutely there's a normalisation and there's an acceptance, not just it's the girls who like accept it and it's normal for them. I mean culturally as a society, like there is an acceptance of that kind of behaviour, absolutely, and it roots into particular gender histories, which also intersect with racial histories as well. And yeah, I remember at the time when gang rape was the hot topic. And I remember when domestic violence was the hot topic, and now gangs, and the ways that girls are being initiated into gangs, and that's part of their initiation process, which includes sexual violence against women. That's like the hot topic, but these are, and obviously Jimmy Savile, hot topic. Oh, how could all these failings from the past, which, like, how do you think Savile happened? And do you honestly think that couldn't happen today? Do you honestly think institutions are not running away in which girls and women are actually vulnerable in those institutions, be they the army or the police force, or in schools, which are institutions, in the NHS and mental health institutions, that somehow sexual violence is also not part of those institutions today in 2013, that the Savile thing just was some crazy time where, I guess it was okay to have sex, this wasn't really violence with underage girls, but I mean these moments are not past, they're still with us, they just become media stories which flag up and then they die down.
I mean, I think what's worrying for me is...
Sorry, can we, because there were some hands up. It's okay, we can hold it, but I think this young man, and then I think you had a thing that you wanted to say after, and then you had one as well.
Yeah, sorry to go backwards on what we're talking about, but I know you touched upon, like in the music industry, and you touched upon the Snoop Lion kind of issue. I'm quite not as knowledgeable as most people in the room, so that's why I'm here, kind of thing. But I just want to know what happened from what you were talking about to where we are now. What happened? Like, how did it go from black men educating to now oppressing, and how it went from, So why are black men oppressing our women when before we were educating them? What happened? En route, let's say.
Can I?
Yes, please answer. Can we all? What happened?
That might just be, I'm not saying that it's necessarily what's happening, but it might go a way to explaining what's happening. In some instances, some victims of, say, violence actually sometimes identify with the perpetrators of the violence. Yeah, it's almost a case of if you cannot beat them, join them. So violence against black men has been, historically has been happening. Now they're perpetuating that on the next weakest person, if you like, or population, their own woman. Do you see how it kind of ripples down that's it, basically. That's one of the maybe explanations of what might be going on there.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, my thought, kind of going back to the just previous conversation, was whether one of the biggest issues is really whether there are women at the height of leadership. And you mentioned Dorothy Height being, on the platform, but no woman spoke at the March on Washington. And similarly, I think someone brought up the issue of after these things started happening, there wasn't really specific training in how to deal with that. And at the same time, you had the major civil rights organizations were run by men, and they were debating, whether it was right to involve children in the civil disobedience, not really talking about what was happening to the girls who were participating. So I just wonder, maybe at some time more current and now, if we have women fighting at sort of the higher echelons to make those issues known, they were sort of swept under the rug a bit during the movement, or they were, you people can go off with the nice Jewish ladies organization and talk about it, but it's not going to be a tenet of the movement. And that could change if women are in higher leadership.
Yeah, and women being leaders is critical. And I think this history points to that, where you see someone like Dorothy Height or Jean Noble understanding, wait a minute, there are oversights here. It's got to be part of the conversation, which is so important, why you need female leadership. This movement is actually run by youth and women. There is no civil rights movement without women and young people. And I guess if we redefine what leadership is, then we will also say that these organizations very much were run by women who we may call them bridge leaders. They sustained it. There just isn't a movement without them. But then we also see this public face, and we see a national discourse, and who gets to shape that discourse? And it's the people that we remember, individuals like King, who weren't ignorant to the fact of what was going on. Some of that brushing under the rug is absolutely strategic. It's selective and it's deliberate, that there will be partial stories given for reasons of protecting the community, but sometimes what will protect some people makes other people vulnerable. And so there was absolutely decisions where, okay, we need to not focus on that because we just need to make sure we get rights for everybody. And actually feeds into what you said, like what happened. And part of this idea of freedom and achieving freedom for many black men is finding we can participate in this hierarchy of masculinity. We can enact masculinity. We can now shape and form a black masculinity. So there was a lot of talk about the emasculation of black men. So how do black men now envision empowerment and re-empowering themselves? How do they join a hierarchy rather than actually attempt to destroy the hierarchy? It's about how can I position myself in the hierarchy. There is power in being male. And black men were more than willing to take that power of being male in a way, and to participate in being male in a way that they had not previously been able to before. A part of participating and being male, which was open to white males, was sleeping with who I choose to sleep with and making decisions for myself, being able to vote and being able to eat where I want to, but also being able to define manhood, which had been defined by white supremacy. and now we can redefine what manhood is. And unfortunately, that was a moment to say, you know what, let's break the hierarchy rather than let's take our position in the hierarchy. And unfortunately, that is crude. But over 50 years, we saw black men saying, for the first time, I'm going to experience manhood and I'm going to use that power because it's been denied to me.
So how
Sorry.
I can't resist the temptation to say that everything that you said just now, one could say, for example, there's now a black president in the US, and link that to the examples you gave earlier about the civil rights movement then and now, and the fact that women and youth were the backbone of the movement. However, there always seemed to be a need to have a male of a certain kind of male front the movement. So when a lot of work was being done by women and young people, it always, including many of the women, by the way, felt that it needed to be fronted by a certain kind of male. And that is the link between, somebody earlier mentioned the link between then and now, right through in civil organizations, in the church, in political organizations, in the Pan-African movement. We see that same issue has continued to reverberate. And that is why some people will argue that the personal is the political, and vice versa. And that is what needs to inform how we behave within our organizations, whether they're churches or business organizations or whatever. And that's why we all should consider ourselves as being held up to scrutiny when we behave in a particular way, whether we could say that's my private business or not. You know, how many wives I have, how I treat my women or girls or whatever is my business and it's a private matter. One has to hold people to account on that score, and that's been a delicate issue in many kinds of organizations here today now, not 50 years ago.
Sorry. You wanted to touch on
it wasn't really a question, I think we're probably past the point now. It was just a reflection on something that was said maybe 20 minutes ago. And I had just been thinking about, the issue of rape. I think it was off the back of something that, was it Leah said about the whole gang rape issue and how colour plays into that. And one of the things that I reflect on is that while we acknowledge that rape is, it's not race specific, it happens in all communities. One of the things that sort of plays out for me in my work when we deal with young black women who are victims of rape and the perpetrators are young black males, we don't want to come forward that there's something really acute happening that's divisive happening between young black women and young black men, like our youth, which concerns me about how they're able to be collective. If the perpetrators are young black men and you're a young black woman, the level of trauma that has for you, if you already have an oppressed identity, is something that we really have to think about in terms of our community. It's just a reflection.
Yeah, I was just wanting to make a comment about something that you were saying earlier. Just that, just looking at the civil rights movement as a whole, I mean, you could say that there's an argument that it was more, would you say it was more of a reformist movement or was it a revolutionary movement? I mean, I'm just trying to decide that one for myself, but
thank you
just
for asking that, because it was on my brain about this revolutionary.
Yeah, just because I was, thinking about how, the presentation of particular cases regarding a woman's virtue, making sure you've got a credible woman who's going to be able to withstand, the onslaught of, racialized stereotypes and whatever, the way she's represented in the media, the way she's represented in court, all of those kind of things. So just the fact that, campaigners had to adopt that kind of political strategy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Having
they
to
do.
play, you know, because, you know, there is an awareness of what the world is really like,
mentality.
the world that, you know, we're all inhabiting. There is that awareness of, you know. So, yeah, so how far would you say, oh, well, you know, civil rights movement was reformist rather than revolutionary, and that, you know, again, it was a failed opportunity for smashing the hierarchy rather than trying to just fit into the hierarchy as it existed then and now.
I mean, we do talk about a civil rights movement, but just as we all know, it is a collection of movements which are in the south, but they're also in the north. They're also playing out on the west coast. And so they're different. And so we are talking about several movements, and we're talking about different people and different components within that movement. So we can't talk about this as one thing. So we can never give an answer to say, overall, was it progressive? Overall, was it radical? There are individuals, there are certain geographical places that are lending to more progressive narratives. But there is also, as you said, we need to engage with the mainstream. At the heart of many of the movements is we need to convince the dominant white population that we are deserving of humanity and citizenship. And so, like you said, each case had to be the right case. As many of you will know in the room, you know, Rosa Parks obviously wasn't the first person who refused to give up her seat. And we know that the NAACP was looking for a test case just before Rosa Parks. It was a 15-year-old black girl who was going to be that test case before Rosa Parks. Claudine, I forget her surname right now, but it turned out that her dad was an alcoholic and that she was actually pregnant. Black pregnant teenager is not going to work. Let's keep looking, you're not going to be our test case. A few weeks later, Rosa Parks does her individual protest, being a very savvy activist. This was not a tired woman on the bus. Rosa Parks has a long history. Her roots are actually in investigating sexual violence against black women. That's Rosa Parks' roots. So she knew what she was doing. Rosa Parks becomes the test case because we can't use a 15-year-old black girl. So you're right. There is that strategy. We need to get the public, we need to get the white public sympathetic. So this movement, and I don't know in the end how radical a movement can be when it's really about how will the white people take this.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, you know, that thing of accommodation rather than, not necessarily confrontation, but, you know, to have that, an accurate appraisal of reality that everybody's willing to take on board. This is what we're presenting you with, and you need to take it on board. And to change your behaviour and to change your ways of your laws, you should change everything accordingly because this is the reality that we're presenting you with.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that, you know, Rosa Parks is the better. I mean, we get that. Rosa Parks is the better test case than a 15-year-old black girl in a way that Stephen Lawrence was the right person because we know how many black teenage boys have been murdered on the streets. You never heard their names. As recently as just weeks ago, because there's a gang relation there, and those stories don't fly. There's a reason why, and I mean they tried to suppress that Stephen Lawrence case. I mean, but there was those right credentials. So it is about being savvy enough. I wouldn't just put it down to accommodation or we're just selling out. It is about being savvy enough. Understand, to take the political temperature, to say, you know what, to be able to engage with that and to deliver our narrative on our terms, but to understand how that's going to fit into a bigger and wider context. And I think that comes down to the savvy of activists then as we have today. I mean, how do you, quite frankly, it's not in dominant interest to really end racism. It's just not. because it supports the economic status quo and the social status quo. And as shocking as that may sound, it's true. There is money to be made from racism. There's always money to be made by controlling and containing. The prison industry is just making
It's an
billions.
industry.
It's
expanding.
So this kind of idea that, yeah, somehow we can sell this idea that, racism is terrible, let's defeat this, without understanding, okay, what are we up against? You need to be savvy enough, and it's not necessarily accommodation.
There was this, you had something.
Yeah, I don't
you
know
had
how
something
relevant
on
it is now, but it's just a few things that were said. One thing I have noticed is misrepresentation of the black community again and again and again and again. And also, some of the things that were said led me back to distraction. So, kind of when we're focusing on what's going on with young black women, it's like, or what's going on with black women in general. Oh, but how about what happened during the Holocaust? Or what about what happened here? Or what about what happened there? A lot of people someone spoke about white supremacy and kind of the hierarchy. And when you look at society, men are up here, women are down there. And if white is up here and black's down there, black women are just going to be there at the very bottom. So it's like we will deal with everything else before we get to what's going on in the foundation. So I think there needs to kind of be a shake-up of what, we view as important and unimportant. And, maybe what we deal with and what we don't deal with. Also, another thing that I was just touching on, I wanted to touch on as well, is what is abuse and rape? Because quite often these young women don't understand that they've been raped, because rape quite often is portrayed as something that's savage and violent. Not, I'm going to coerce you to do something for me, and if you really love me, you will do this. That within itself is rape. Yeah, so in terms of, yeah. So in terms of the way rape is viewed, we have a lot of young black women walking around damaged, not even realising, what women in general, but I'm speaking about black women, walking around damaged and not understanding, that what happened was rape. So I feel like I've been violated, but on the other hand, I feel like I wanted to do that, but I didn't want to do it, and where do I stand with this? Also, women not being leaders. So black women not being leaders, but being blamed for the outcome, is what I find quite often. So it's coming back to that demonisation of the black woman again. Maybe you're in a situation where, and I'm not using this as a stereotype, just an example, a child does something and maybe the father isn't around, nobody's looking at the father, you as a woman, you're not raising your child right. So that whole demonisation of the black woman, if we're demonising her in terms of what she's going through and what she's possibly going through, or the injustices that she's felt, people aren't always going to want to hear it as much. Because like you're saying, it's not palatable. People aren't trying to hear that. She's doing this, that and the other. Why are we talking about this when in reality she's not doing what she's meant to be doing? And the only reason why I bring it up is I've seen it in my job. I see it a lot of the time. The way black women and black men are treated when they walk through the front door is really negative. And people are really resistant to work with them because of what the media and that kind of thing put out there.
And representation is absolutely key. Absolutely key. And even how we represent this history, even the history of black women in enslavement and rape, often in popular narratives, but it also happened in academia before we really had to just check ourselves and move away from that. The rape of black women was framed as the controlling and punishment for black men. So even our own rape was about its effect on black men, because it emasculated them and how it would make them feel. And we wouldn't even talking about rape and enslavement as being first and foremost against black women. It's not a crime against black men. But scholars would talk about rape as being this thing against black men. But that continues today. And so we have these demonization narratives, which there are gender narratives and narratives of women, but they play out in specific racialized ways. Yeah, just the strong black woman, but yeah, she's got a chip on her shoulder and she can't raise her kids on her own. And if it's a boy kid, well, he's going to be running the streets. If he's running the street, that's her fault. And yeah, and then there's also a class angle, because it's like, them what, that's black woman. And yeah, that narrative, and you will see, and our community is engaging in that and promoting that narrative too.
Sorry, because obviously our time, we're doing this very well.
I've been reading some like James Baldwin, and he was talking about.
Can you just speak a bit louder?
Okay, so I was reading James Baldwin, and he was talking about kind of exploring the idea of, in order to, so for example, you have that it's the civil rights movement, and you have like the opposing views of say Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party, and you kind of question the need to be like the oppressor in order to overcome oppression. And how does that relate to, say, masculinity and gender, whereas to be seen as like a strong black woman, you almost have to have a sense of masculinity, but it has to be kind of almost, it has to, it's almost like a violent tendency, an intimidation aspect of it in order for that to be labeled as strong, even in like stuff like action movies and stuff. And for a woman to be seen as, formidable or dangerous, she has to be like busting a gun or something. Like where is the balance between that and just
That's a good question, and I would totally goes into what you were saying. Just distinguishing between the narrative and what does that narrative serve, dominant discourses which are informed by racism and sexism and many other things. So this idea of the strong black woman who's actually probably just a bit too masculine, and you have reports commissioned, in the 60s in the United States that say, and that's the reason why we're all messed up, because the black woman is too masculine. So how could a black man cope with that? He's emasculated. And that's part of the narrative. And so we got to be careful to define our own stories and our own history and not buy into the construction and the narrative of the strong black woman. It's very loaded. It may sound very complimentary to say the strong black woman, but that is absolutely connected to a history which says the black woman is pathological because she came out of enslavement and she also had to rear her family. She's not a part of normal, which is a white patriarchal setup. Therefore, because she worked out of that, she isn't normal like other women. And so that strength is a perversion. But it's a perversion of patriarchy, which is not empowering for anybody. And the idea that because her oppression doesn't look like the oppression of other women, there's something wrong with her. And therefore, your community, you can root back all the problems to her, because that strength is a perversion. Because she shouldn't really be acting like that. And she doesn't have those feminine qualities. And even, Mammy, who looked after all the little kids and raised the white children, isn't a sexual being. She's asexual. I mean, Mammy wouldn't have a relationship. Mammy wouldn't have sex because she has no sex. She's sexless. So it's just, even using those phrases are like, strong black women, understanding that they have really racialized. They come out of racist histories in which it says that we're pathological. And that's why you're the way you are. Not because of racism and enslavement and economic, oppression. It's just because you just wasn't raised in an oppressive white patriarchy. So just being aware of that. Can't get into James Baldwin right now, but really interesting constructions of black masculinity. But I would just quickly pose the question to say for yourself and your friends, do you understand that you are privileged, that you use the privilege of maleness? And are you aware of how you use maleness? And are you prepared to not use that? Because it could be, freedom for some is about being able to use the power that is available to them. but that power ultimately is destructive for the community. And as a man, you may be like, I'm a man and I'm going to use that power along with other men. Why should black men not have, now that they have access to that power, not use that? But to be in a hierarchy, someone has to be beneath you, and that means you participate in others' oppression. And some of those others are black women, specifically. And your position in a hierarchy is absolutely dependent on the oppression of black women. Until you are personally prepared to look, well, how do I use maleness? How do I use masculinity? I mean, you might not even be aware of how you use your masculinity and how it might actually be oppressive, because you may see your masculinity as a good thing. I mean, I don't know, but this is some questions for you to ask yourselves. Like, in what ways my own participation in my masculinity actually serve to oppress others?
I can, sorry, only have none.